You know, Eric, Christians, of course, played a huge role in 2016
Yes.
in the election. How important will they be in 2020?
I think they'll be awfully important. But it's a funny thing. Whenever I get asked about that, I think to myself, you know, the main thing about being a Christian, we were just talking about Bonhoeffer off the air. Bonhoeffer said that Jesus is the man for others. And so Christians sometimes are perceived as being all about Christians and Christian values and whatever. And you realize, no, a real Christian cares about everybody and about the whole country. So you're not really voting Christian values as much as you're voting values which you think will bless everybody. And I think the biggest one, and this is why the Supreme Court is such a big issue, is religious liberty. Something has happened in America in the last 20 or so years where a lot of the key people, I'm talking senators, Senator Feinstein is the worst, who ought to know this like they know their alphabet. It's the most basic part of American liberty. They have slipped. They don't understand it anymore. And they don't understand that once you begin to force people to accept certain values, you're abrogating their liberty, their religious liberty. This is something that I think Christians are finally seeing happen. We've talked about it for years. It's been creeping and creeping. But I think that if we don't have real religious liberty and judges in all our courts, but on the Supreme Court in particular, that really understand how important the Constitution is and how important religious liberty is, we're dead as a nation. You cannot have the United States of America, forget who's president, you cannot have the United States of America if you don't have justices on the Supreme Court who understand these issues and a culture that respects those issues, and that is a huge thing. So I think that the main thing that Christians should worry about today when they vote is that, because it affects everything.
Eric, I think it's interesting that you mentioned California Senator Dianne Feinstein, because many in her party might look at her as a moderate or old school Democrat.
Yeah.
And the Democratic Party seems to be drifting further and further to the left
Yeah.
with progressive policy. So how will that score points in 2020, especially if they're trying to have a big tent and invite evangelical voters to vote for their candidates?
They're not going to get evangelical voters, and they can, smoke whatever drug they want, but there is no way, if you do not, first of all, if you do not have basic, clear values, which they used to have, and they don't anymore, you're going to therefore drift because you don't know, where there's no anchor. And so if you have loud voices in the party talking about like really crazy stuff, like we should let 16-year-olds vote. Why 16? 14-year-olds are the 16-year-olds of the future. 12-year-olds are the 16. They're advocating things, and nobody really has, let's say, the guts, the chutzpah, the courage to say no. Here is why that's a bad idea. So if you're not grounded in particular values, I would say in the Constitution and in the values of the founders, if you don't really get that, you're going to be open to whatever comes along. And what has come along, it becomes kind of a mob mentality, is socialism, which you should be laughed out of the room at this point in America for suggesting socialism. Not for suggesting that we care for the poor, but for suggesting that the way to do that is socialism. If you want to destroy the poor and the middle class and everyone, socialism is the way to do it. You'll decrease wealth and you'll destroy everybody. So you should be laughed out of the room for that. You should be laughed out of the room for suggesting that prisoners in prison could vote. You should be laughed out of the room for saying 16-year-olds should vote. And it goes on and on and on. The Green New Deal, you don't even want to begin to talk about that.
Eric, what about critics who would say if you talk about morals and values for evangelical Christians who support Donald Trump,
right,
who has been questioned about some of his values and
obviously
morals? So how do you square that up by saying that Democrats...
Well, I think all of us sitting here and anybody watching knows that we are 100% against adultery, right? We don't go like, I'm going to give adultery a pass because I want more originalists on the Supreme Court. You don't change your values, but what you try to do is you look at the two candidates and you say, which one is, let's put it negatively, which one is the least corrupt? Which one is more likely to put the country ahead of himself? The Clintons in the last go-around, they've become infamous for corruption, infamous for power politics and playing power politics even within their own party, bumping Bernie Sanders. I mean, you know, if that happened in a roller derby, you know, there'd be a flag on the field. You know, you can't do some of the stuff that they've done. So I think Christians have had to sharpen what they mean when they talk about character. What do you mean? And also, let's say somebody does something in the White House, in the Oval Office, the way Bill Clinton did. JFK, I hate to say it, brought prostitutes into the White House many times. Nobody says, let's take them off the 50-cent piece. LBJ did all kinds of disgusting things in the White House. So it's really complicated, and people like to make it real simple and go, Donald Trump's a jerk, he did this and this and this, how can Christians support him? And I think, what are you talking about? First of all, we're not meaning to elect a Christian, we're meaning to elect a man like a Ben Franklin, who was not particularly Christian, or we've had many people, Eisenhower. Their Christianity was I think Donald Trump may know more about the Christian faith than they did, at least in the case of Eisenhower. And so I think the whole thing is forcing a really healthy national conversation. It's forcing Christians to think about, what do I really care about?